Coming up, with free agency set to begin, we take a look at the possibilities for the Brooklyn Nets in the back and front court. How do they improve their guard play, and can they get a more substantial upgrade or depth in the power forward or small forward position? We break it all down. Coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I, of course, am Adam Marbeck, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms, and tell you that today you can go ahead and download the Game Time app. Create an account and use promo code, all caps, Locked On NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And what we are guaranteed to do today, my friends, is continue our journey towards NBA free agency. We know we have a lot coming up here, potentially for the Brooklyn Nets, a lot coming up here around the NBA landscape. And obviously, we're going to look at what the Nets currently have on their roster, what the options are out there in free agency, using the John Hollinger Athletic article, just kind of breaking down the board's evaluation, which takes into age, skill set, right, relative market compared to others at the same position, to try to give a clear view around where the Nets could spend their TPE, their MLE, or if they make some moves on the roster, go ahead and just spend real cap money to improve this team going forward. And we start in the backcourt. We'll discuss the team right now as it currently stands, and maybe even if we have a chance, get to what has been a little bit of chaos for some former Brooklyn Nets. Kyrie Irving out there on the market, maybe meeting with the Suns. James Harden opting in and looking for a sign and trade away from Philadelphia. So a lot of the chaos of the Brooklyn Nets organization experience over the last few years, it looks like some other teams around the league are going to have to go through that process as well right now. So we're at least optimistic that this can be a little more straightforward for the Brooklyn Nets. Backcourt-wise, when we go over and take a look at the point guards available on the open market by the John Hollinger article, and there's actually a couple of guys that even came up here, lower end, back end guys that the Nets could take a look at, because some teams are also starting to just outright release players from their contracts, not give them the qualifying offer, not maintain a restricted free agent status on them. And some of that comes down to negotiations and being able to continue to operate with more cap room while having those discussions. And in other scenarios, it's outright going to free agency. So when we go ahead and hit this, we're not going to touch on, by the way, the aforementioned Kyrie Irving at the top of the point guard spectrum. You also have guys like Fred VanVleet. You have a player like D'Angelo Russell, who, oddly enough, man, $26 million is the evaluation there. I think that, as John Hollinger notes, is high from an evaluation standpoint. His playoff run was not the best, and I would expect that to have to be a little bit of a come down. But fourth on this list is Trey Jones, restricted free agent for the San Antonio Spurs. And he, to me, is just an interesting example of a player on a team that we don't necessarily think about, because it's San Antonio and they're ho-hum, and because over the last couple of seasons, they have not been the most productive on-court organization. Now, the fact that they've got Wembanyama coming in the door here makes it a little bit different maybe now. But when you go and look at a player like this, and we'll talk about where the numbers are for him just in terms of overall. This past season, 68 games, started 65, averaged just under 30 minutes, gave you 13 points a game. And when you look at a player, undersized guard, as we all know, but the fact that you could look at him, not a three-point shooter, that's a bit of a downside. 46% from the field as he's increased his volume and his minutes. Obviously, that's been a concern too. The assist numbers, though, 6.6 per game. You have to like what you're getting from him in that category. And even though he's an undersized guard, almost 3.5 rebounds per game over 29 minutes. listen, he's a 13-point scorer per game. This is not the kind of player that when you bring his name up, it automatically jumps off the page for you. Um, However, what I do find interesting about it is you look at him less as a starter and more as a high-level backup. And you may be saying, if you're going to spend upwards of the high end of the TPE on a player, are you really going to do that in a backup role? Well, when you look inside the Nets roster right now, we know that Spencer Dinwiddie is not a pure point guard, but I think also we've skewed our perspective based on the 4-game playoff sample size rather than what we were seeing from him at the back end of the season after coming over in the trade from the Dallas Mavericks. Was able to facilitate, obviously has a lot more size because he's playing at a point guard position as a 2 guards body. But if you start to put together a group of players in that backcourt that, yes, should include Cam Thomas, and we should see him get every opportunity to have more legitimate run and solidify his role inside of that group. Well, now we're talking about Spencer Dinwiddie, maybe a player like Trey Jones, a Cam Thomas, and then you can continue to build out from there, maybe with some smaller market moves. Is he worth Trey Jones at 23 years old, 17, $18 million a year? Maybe, maybe not. But what I did think was interesting is, as Hollinger notes, going back potentially to the San Antonio Spurs on a devaluing contract that maybe, sorry, an escalating contract that maybe starts closer to 15 million, then rises towards 20 over a 4-year deal, something in the range of 50 million over 3 years, right? So you're talking 15 to 17 million over 3 seasons with new money coming in. As far as commitments go, you'd be pretty hard pressed to look at a player like that and think that you won't at least get the value for a position of need that you have on your roster. And he even goes a little bit deeper here when he talks about the Spurs bringing back a 4-year, $70 million deal. And this is where he goes de-escalating if you're the Spurs because you have the cap room. 20 million to start and then de-escalating all the way down to 15 million as the cap could potentially be moving towards 180 million by the time you get towards the back of it, right? So there's an interesting way to get there. Does this excite you entirely? No. Is he a scrappy defender? Certainly. Again, the facilitation, I think, is what you would like the most. Someone that goes out there and can be that floor kind of general for you, whether he's coming in the second unit or flexing a little bit into the starting rotation. Again, the shooting's not good enough. You're going to be far more dependent on players like Mikal Bridges, on Spencer Dinwiddie if he's in there, on Cameron Johnson, assuming he's coming back. Like, all of those things are going to play big factors in a decision like this. But I think you at least have to take a look at this player if you're looking to spend the TPE and you're making these decisions about not being able to just get every player you may want or solve every need that you have. As we move through this, the backcourt here, other guys that we'll note, and we're going to go into some lower level players because I had 3 other key names that I want to mention and then another one that became available. I will note a guy like Dennis Schroeder coming in there at 11.7 million on his evaluation. Again, I like him. I just think that he's a guy that projects to probably end up going maybe back to the Lakers, sticking with his team. I don't think that is a guy out on the open market that you necessarily look as being a highly sought after player at the point guard position. Javon Carter falls onto this list. People have mentioned Dennis Smith Jr. before, not interested there. Gabe Vincent, Miami. I'm not in love with that. And then we could also even talk about Aaron Holiday out of Atlanta. He would fall underneath that mid-level exception as well, under somewhere in like the $5 million range. You could say, again, undersized, but he has good body frame. He can be physical, and he hits at a nice percentage when we talk about 3-point shooting. 37% for his career and 41% nearly from beyond the arc. So those are just a couple extra options I wanted to throw in here before we transition in a moment to talking about other key players they could go into in the backcourt specifically. Beyond the point guard role, we'll mention 1 or 2 more guys here that I would take a look at just to help build out competition, help build out the back end of your roster. Certainly options to continue as we prepare for NBA free agency. But before we do that, friends, we got to tell you about our other friends, and those would be the good guys over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, talked about them yesterday on the show. Going to talk about them again today. That's because you know that if you just want to pick 2 to 6 players and project whether or not they're going to score more or less than their prize picks projections, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Obviously, you get into some of these waters. There's sharks out there. They know exactly what they're doing. You're just looking to have a good time, man. You could take the over coming up on, let's see, if we're going into the NBA season, I'm going to take the over on Mikal Bridges most nights. I'm going to take the over on Nicholas Claxton rebounds most nights, right? So you can put them together there. And obviously, Prize Picks offers projections on any sport you can watch, including NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball, and so much more. You head over right now and download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code all caps locked on. If you deposit 100, you get 100. Deposit 50, get 50. You can do it on down the line there. And that means that you do not want to forget to enter that promo code all caps locked on and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Okay, so as we continue the conversation around NBA free agency, preparing for what the Brooklyn Nets could do, worth noting. So I mentioned before we move kind of into some backcourt names that I was keeping an eye on. I have my trusty notepad here, by the way, too. I want to make sure that I didn't miss out on anybody else that I was mentioning. Specifically in the point guard role, another guy that I would be targeting is a heavy-handed word, but a player that I would be offering probably a contract to if I was looking at youth. That's a player like Theo Maledon. He obviously is someone who ended up being a two-way player, goes and turns around a little bit his prospects by reducing the number of threes and upping his assist numbers, right? He only made under 30% from beyond the arc, but he's starting to get a little bit more stable on the defensive end. He's starting to show you that he can play consistently, be a bit more of a facilitator. Just 22 years old, was in Charlotte, started in OKC. I would, at the right number, being put out here as 3.9 million, a little bit high, but I wouldn't hate bringing a player like that in. He's sitting there on a two-way restricted contract with Charlotte. I would spend money on him at the back end of this process just to elevate what you're getting there. Remember, David Duke Jr. not extended an offer. Drew Smith not extended an offer. So not only do the Nets need help in the starting role, in the rotation role, they also need to make sure that they're filling out the back end of this process for themselves. I mentioned Ty Jerome here too. I won't even get into the weeds on him. Just as guys I was looking at, 25 out of Golden State there, two-way contract for him. We'll move on, though, into the other backcourt, the two-guard role. And that's because there are a couple of key guys that I would look at here if we're talking about where we think you could go as the Brooklyn Nets. Remember, TPE available, MLE up to 6.7, 6.8 million available for the Brooklyn Nets. So we turn our attention towards the two guard where, guess what? James Harden, he could be available, man. He's opted in. We could trade for him if we put the right package together. You go through Josh Hart. He is opting into his player option. They're going to continue to negotiate there in New York. He'll be going back there. Austin Reeves, that's another one, 22.8. Gary Trent Jr., Toronto, assuming that he's going to stay there, but like Toronto is a weird team, wouldn't necessarily be on my list, even if he fell underneath there. And then you blow past guys like Jordan Clarkson, and you get to a player like Coby White. I think everybody has their eyes on Chicago. They're bringing back Vucevic on a 3-year deal. They have obviously players with injury concerns on that roster, especially in the backcourt. And that even includes a player like Alex Caruso, who is the veteran. So it looks like they're running back their veteran group of players. They have not only Coby White, but they also have Dosunmu, who's going to be there as well. Now, Dosunmu is, you're going to look at him primarily on one end of the court right now and then project about what he could be later. We'll talk about his number. But Coby White right now is sitting at 18.6 million in the board's evaluation. He is a guy that I really like. He's a guy that if you could, I would go target and try to get. However, it just seems likely that Chicago, having some flexibility in their cap, are going to look to basically like maintain this thing and then reevaluate another year from now, or reevaluate maybe even at the deadline, right? Last season did not go according to plan for them, but it doesn't mean that they're just going to all of a sudden bail out on a couple of young players. And in Coby White, you're talking about a guy who finally, still at just 23 years old, but seemed to put it together in a much more consistent way this past season, really this second half of this past season, than he had in years prior. So you talk about the 2023 regular season, 74 games, only started 23 minutes, 10 points, basically a 10-point shooter, 37 from beyond the arc, 44 from the field, about 3 assists. Yeah, again, 23 minutes. Do you want to put the weight of him going into a 30-minute role and being thrust into a starting lineup? Maybe not, but I do like his size at 6'5". I like the length that he brings. I've always liked his game, but is he worth going and spending the 17, north of 17, $18 million a year on a contract? That would be the question for me. People have brought up Dante DiVincenzo. I don't know how that's going to pan out for him. I don't think that he's necessarily in the target group. Interestingly enough, on this evaluation, Karis LeVert pops up at $10.5 million, which I just find surprising, because they say there's a role for him. The injuries are obviously there. It seems like a low number. Hollinger does note that signing like a shorter term deal that offers the Cavs some flexibility and then they could always reevaluate is probably the most likely. And you can use the non-taxpayer MLE and biannual exceptions to fill out that depth situation there. So they'll probably try to negotiate an avenue where they can retain LeVert in the short term, but always leave the door open to move off of him. Don't see that being likely. Josh Okogie was the other guy that obviously is circled here, simply because less than mid-level. Talk about tier 4 guys, mid-level exemptions. I like him. 24 years old. Again, will the Suns automatically try to retain him? What's going to go on with this Kyrie Irving conversation? So there's just a world where a player like this shakes free, and you can kind of elevate some of your depth. Beyond that, just in terms of, and I know I ran through a lot of these names very quickly, Coby White, it would be at the top of my target list. If you wanted to get down into the Dosunmu conversations, restricted free agent, 5.8 million is his board's projection. I did want to make sure that I mentioned him here. Again, you're projecting on upside here, and that's why the number is where it's at. Could you get him underneath the 6.7 MLE? Maybe, but at that point, I think that he has a 5.2 qualifying offer that could go in, should be able to bring him back, and then you could, marginally look at someone making an offer. But if you're the Brooklyn Nets and you want to go a little bit higher, you want to use all that MLE, you just have to be committed to the idea of spending that money on this player and projecting what he could be going forward. So, again, I'm not against that. I mentioned a guy like Theo Maledon. Like, Dosunmu is a significant step above that in terms of where he is in his game and what he's shown for you. It's just a matter of, do you believe in investing in someone like that at that price point? So Coby White, when we talk about the backcourt, DiVincenzo, he was listed, by the way, at 16.2, and MLE ceiling is what Hollinger projects there, 4 for $52 million in that range. So that number comes down. It's just not going to fall into the pocket where the Nets could make a move on a player like that if they wanted to, without clearing out some other cap space and cleaning up some problems that they have money-wise. Last 2 guys I'm going to mention here. From the Pelicans, Kira Lewis Jr., outright going to be able to walk away from the Pelicans and go test the market for himself. 25 games in 2023, 4.6 per game. Here's what you like, right? 45% from the field, 44% from beyond the arc, 86% free throw shooter. Again, small, undersized, right? 6'1" point guard. But if we're going to have conversations about low cost and potential upside, when you lack depth in your backcourt, taking a flyer on a guy who you can now go back over 3 seasons, has played 103 games at the NBA level. The minutes came down this past year, but he's a 14, 15-point minute per game player in the NBA. The field goal percentage went up significantly this past season. He's gone from 38%, 39% when he entered the league, now up to 45% on a reduced volume. Likewise, shot better from beyond the arc, significantly better from beyond the arc than the year prior. Only took about 1.5 per game. On a smaller minute size, on a smaller sample size, he can still be an impact player for you. Mention the free throw shooting. The assist numbers are what they are. That's just the guy that's probably not going to cost you anything. Bring him into camp. Bring a guy like him into camp. RJ Hampton also going to be able to walk away and test the market as well for himself. Another name you think about him just because of 6'4", which you certainly like at the shooting guard position. Still going to be a little bit undersized even in that role. Coming in though at just 22 years old. Do the evaluation. 162 games in his NBA career. He has, yes, bounced around significantly, but he is shooting it at a low 42, 43% from the field. You don't love that. You do, however, like that his three-point shooting, averaging 2 to 3 attempts. 3 attempts essentially over the course of these last few seasons. Hit a career high, 36, almost 37% this past year. So effective field goal percentage, just 51, 52%. But this is a guy that beyond now the fact that his free throw shooting came down significantly, just 67%. Again, another guy out there on the market, very low cost. Bring him in the background here and try to build out the back end of your roster when you know that you are devoid of not just potential starters, not just rotation players, but just young talent that you can continue to evaluate in the background. And we know also you brought in Dariq Whitehead through the draft here, who's going to be a combo, can shift up a little bit depending on how you want to play him, has a lot of length. But you want to safeguard against guys, young guys that you've brought in Clowney. This is position irrelevant here. And also injuries, obviously, and guys that are coming back. So those are the last couple of names that I want to make sure that we made note of there. Now, coming up in a second, as we just are on a barn burner of a pace, we will discuss the front court. And I will make a note about one Bill Simmons and what he had to say in his predictions for contracts in free agency, which included one Cameron Johnson. We'll see if it makes any Nets fans sweat as we also look at some good options on the market for Brooklyn. And we'll do all that coming up next. But first, game time. Oh, it's game time. Yeah, you know, the buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Me right now, what's going on is MLS soccer. Red Bulls fan over here, and it's right in the middle of their season. So I know that Game Time is the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets for all your sports, music, comedy, and theater events with killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee. You can stop stressing over tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you're going to have. The fun you're going to have. That's just not just sports, right? You could go in to see the theater. You could go see Miss Saigon, assuming that it's still on Broadway in the city. I'm not sure. Cats, Cats may not be on there. Lion King's on there. You could go see that. That'd be fun and exciting for the whole family. Forget about planning month in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, baseball, basketball, and we said concerts and everything else. Game Time guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and the same row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. That means that you can feel secure about having a good time and knowing that you're also getting the best deal. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you are all set. And of course, all you need to do is snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code all caps locked on NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code all caps locked on NBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. And what you're guaranteed to have is a fun closeout to a free agency frenzy episode, because we know it'll be kicking off later today. We'll probably be getting news breaking potentially right now. I'll stick around for a few extra minutes when you're flying solo on the podcast episode. As we always say, it's a little bit trickier to monitor what's happening, especially doing some of these lives. And if you're not subscribed over on YouTube, which is 100% free to do, you may not have been able to enjoy me being live the last 3 mornings leading up here to free agency. So always make sure that you're doing that. Let's talk about Grant Williams of the Boston Celtics, set to enter restricted free agency. You heard comments from him, surprised obviously by Marcus Smart being traded. The Boston Celtics are trying to get better. They're trying to improve. And in order to do that, you're going to have to make some difficult decisions. Now, when we talk about one Grant Williams and where that evaluation comes in with the Athletic, John Hollinger, and the board's evaluation, you are talking about, which by the way, This is, I will say, quick note, and we're actually getting into into the power forward conversation here. Cam Johnson, Bill Simmons projected, and he just, he's shooting it from the hip here. I'm not holding him to it. And he had to make some adjustments to it because certain trades and things happened after the fact. But he projected a 4-year, $115 million contract offer for Cameron Johnson in free agency, and that the Brooklyn Nets would match it. The board's evaluation with John Hollinger here was 26.3. And by the way, he notes, John Hollinger, don't be surprised if the bidding on Johnson gets a little wacky simply because rival teams know they might be able to scare the Nets from matching if they can present a strong offer sheet. We know that Monty Williams and the Detroit Pistons are lurking in the background here, right? Imagine being a guy that turned down a $78 million contract extension from the Phoenix Suns, and you're now sitting here in the offseason as a restricted free agent, potentially looking at getting a contract upwards of $28 or $29 million a year. If it gets to that number, now you say the Nets are going to match it, but does that number start to get really out of hand here. And if we want to stay in this pocket right now, you can go past the PJ Washingtons of the world, the Jeremy Grants. I think that the Blazers are pot committed there. Harrison Barnes is re-upped with the Kings. And then we get to one Grant Williams. So we said restricted free agent. Board's projection is just about 15 million here. So the Nets would have to use their TPE in order to get him in the door. Listen, I'm not in love with going and getting him. I bring up the name because he's been on the minds of Brooklyn Nets fans. He played 79 games and started 23 last year. He averaged his last 2 seasons about 25, 26 minutes a game. He shoots a good percentage from inside the arc. The three-point shooting is what you love, right? I mean, listen, it's hard to argue with a guy that is a career 38% from beyond the arc, but these last 2 seasons, 41 and 39% from deep, respectively. The Nets need a player like this, or at least a skill set like this inside of it. You also like that he's just a physical player. Yes, he's undersized, but he brings what Doug and I have talked about, some tenacity, some energy. You want that. You want that really bad for this Brooklyn Net roster. Does that mean that it needs to be Grant Williams? No. But in the world where Boston cannot retain him, or in the world where Cameron Johnson gets an offer that like what we're talking about here, I think a pivot for the Brooklyn Nets would at least be looking in the direction of, let's say, a Grant Williams as a possibility, because he brings in a certain cobbled together set of skills that you can like. Now, you can't just outright sign the player like that. We understand, right? Can you get into sign and trade scenarios? Not necessarily with Boston, but can you move these pieces around? Maybe there's an opportunity there. If we continue to work down this list, Kyle Kuzma, don't care because he's most likely going back to Washington on some big money. Guys like Jay Crowder also get thrown out here. I did make a note about Trey Lyles here at the power forward position. Why? Because you're talking about an 8.4 million boards projection. He's unrestricted here. So you're talking about a guy that shot 37% from deep. I like at least the idea that this is a guy that could cost you under 10 million. Now you get a little bit beyond the MLE, so there'd be some work here to do. But he's a guy that I would keep an eye on simply because he has the three-point shooting. The Nets are going to need to replace that. We've even heard rumors that maybe there have been some calls about Joe Harris. Very fascinated to see how teams are presenting opportunities like that for the Brooklyn Nets. Are you talking about, taking the money and requiring a pick? Is there a dropping of a player and a contract that you're not necessarily interested in? Because even if the Brooklyn Nets had to take back something significant contract wise, if the skill set could work out, then you have an opportunity here, right? A restricted free agent that goes through a sign and trade and gets sent to Brooklyn. That's interesting to me. I also mentioned another player here, which would be, and I know, believe me, I'm running through at pace here because I want to make sure that we touch on all these guys and remind you that throughout today, there's going to be network coverage around free agency. As things break, I'll hop on. I'll be doing a live later this afternoon. So don't worry about missing out on any of those updates, obviously, as well. But getting back to our conversation around an O'Shea Brissett in a crowded backcourt for the Indiana Pacers. Again, only 41% from the field, so that is a concern for you. Upped his three-point shooting this past season to nearly 35%, so I can you can kind of squint and see again when we're talking about players that fall into the $7.9 million range. It's just an interesting player to take a look at, even though, again, his struggles inside the arc, getting closer to the basket, are very evident. At his age, though, 25, you can still think of, as Hollinger notes, getting better from beyond the arc as well. So there's avenues here where you might be catching a guy that still has a little bit of growth to his game, and you're getting it at a very friendly number against the cap. He might be kind of this muddling secondary or third option that you get into. The Rui Hachimura, 20, he falls down very low on the board's evaluation. Playoffs pushed him well out of this range, I think. Someone did mention George Niang out of Philadelphia. Not interested in a player who, again, shoots the ball from deep very well. However, not going to be a great defender. It just feels too one-to-one in terms of the issues that the Brooklyn Nets have run into with Joe Harris's skill set. However, if you're talking about a guy that you can get underneath the MLE, that's different, right? If Joe Harris was on the Brooklyn Nets roster at $5 or $6 million, we wouldn't even be having the conversation. You'd just be saying, hey, I hope he can come in and hit some threes, right? But at 30 years old, I wouldn't go that route either. Who are the other guys that I mentioned? Anybody of note? And by the way, those two players came from Biff Johnson and from Russell and Fro, Grant Williams and George Niang. Those are two guys that they wanted to have a conversation on. So check that box off. We're going to run a little bit long and strong here as we dip into the small forward market and make sure that we close out this conversation correctly. Even if we jumped in terms of height, we moved our way up the scale here, right? So, and by the way, I'll stick around to keep this conversation going. I'm sure that the network note will be take a breath and slow down on an episode like this, but you can't. I found it fascinating that there's a couple of things, some names that have come up here in terms of being on the market and really targetable for teams, like hearing that Brooke Lopez and the LA Lakers are getting linked here, other teams getting brought up for Brooke Lopez. I really thought that Milwaukee was going to be in a run it back kind of scenario. So fascinating to watch what happens with a player like that, as we talked about the center position yesterday. And even Bruce Brown, by the way, another guy that's being talked about, linked to LA potentially. He's right there at the top of the TPE. Would you want to bring back Bruce? Would you bring back Bruce Brown on a $17.7 million contract? That, to me, is interesting. And it feels like, with the way things are trending, returning to Denver would be hard to do. And I think if you're the Brooklyn Nets, it's also hard to bring that player in because you are an undersized team and you have so many areas of need, despite our affinity for the Spruce Bruce. Dylan Brooks is on this list too. Way too high of a number at 17.7. But if the number was lower, I would certainly think about it. Watching where his market goes would be fascinating for me. Taylor Horton Tucker is also on this list. Guy can't shoot a lick, but he's an incredible facilitator for his position, and does a great job defensively. Again, 14.2 million. That feels high to me as well. As we roll through this list, though, we come to maybe one I'm very interested to see how the Brooklyn Nets fan base, feels about this, and that is one Kelly Oubre out of Charlotte. Why? Because the board's evaluation on him is 11.9 million. And Hollinger notes that, like, this is a guy that is legitimately probably flying under the radar. He's only 32% from deep and 33% for his career. But he can score, right? He averaged 30 points per 100 possessions last year, and he's an excellent guy when we talk about getting out in transition. So in totality, when we think about the Brooklyn Nets improving their roster here through free agency and trying to add these pieces, if you can add, and we can look at this two ways. If you can add another facilitator to the backcourt, yes, that's great value. If you can look at Spencer Dinwiddie and say, hey, whatever he is not, he certainly showed himself to be malleable and able to make some of the right plays and set up teammates. Or if you dream a little dream that Ben Simmons comes on the court and plays at all this season, an athletic player like Kelly Oubre would certainly represent a value for the Brooklyn Nets that right now, when you look at Mikal Bridges, when you look at Cameron Johnson, and even offensively, when we think about Nicholas Claxton, also a guy's going to get out and play in transition, doesn't have a shot really to his game at this moment. He's working on that little turnaround, that little push shot. But when you think about just infusing a little bit of athleticism into this group, Kelly Oubre at the right price point, I think is actually a very interesting option. And I just wonder, we talk about too, coming off the bench, want to make sure I noted that he was 53% shooting percentage last year and 54 for his career. So it'll be interesting to see if his market is not robust. I would really like the Nets kind of, and the age fits here too, right? The skill set and age fits here for the Brooklyn Nets to maybe capitalize on a player that needs to take a shorter term contract, maybe look for that bigger deal 2 or 3 years from now. And the Nets could value that and get in on the action. Other guys, just to close things out here, I want to make sure I did mention Bates Diop when I was jotting down my notes. Again, mostly because he's going to be underneath 10 million in the range here on the board's evaluation. He's 27 years old. He falls into it. And he's on a Spurs team that is going to have to make some decisions. He still played pretty well on a Spurs team that wasn't very good, right? 39% from deep, limited volume, 55.7 shooting inside the arc. So a guy to keep an eye on there. Price is probably a little bit too high for me to really be fully invested in him. And the last name that I'll mention here, we're doing it, friends, is Delano Banton from Toronto, restricted free agent, 23 years old. This is on the guaranteed minimum tier, the final tier. He is just a guy that is, again, he falls into the category of Akira Lewis Jr., of a Theo Maladone, right? Young player, developing player, upside player that you could turn around. And when it noted here by Hollinger, facing a complicated summer for the Raptors, it's not clear where Banton's future is headed. Toronto can keep his restricted rights with a $2.9 million qualifying offer and have early bird rights on him in any case. So they have a clear path to retaining him. But I'll also say that, again, for the marginal cost of improving that group, of bringing in another player into that room to offer you some upside depth on this roster, these are guys that you need to take a look at. Okay. I could probably go a lot longer here, and we'll stick around for a few minutes on the bonus content. Thank you to everybody that came in on another live edition here. We ended up covering the entire spectrum of backcourt and front court options. Yes, the title of this episode included Grant Williams in it. It doesn't mean that he needs to be the first choice, the prime choice, or the best choice for the Brooklyn Nets, nor does Trey Jones. But this is, as we talked about previously when we looked at Christian Wood, right? This is where the top end of the TPE affords the Brooklyn Nets to look. And then this is how we see it as we gradually make our way down the list and try to evaluate how the Brooklyn Nets get better if they can't go out to market and spend real dollars. If they do bring back on a matching offer Cameron Johnson at a very large, north of $26 million deal, they're going to have to play in these waters here if they want to make sure that they have that roster construction that affords them to be developing young players and also staying competitive and making those playoffs. All right. If you are not over on YouTube, as Doug would tell you, you're just missing out on bonus content and live opportunities just like this one. So get over there and subscribe. Get over on the podcast feed. Remember that it's all free. It's all 5 days a week. And sometimes on a day like this, it's bonus days because you'll see me. Excuse me, I get choked up when I talk about doing extra content all across the network today as any news, hopefully for the Brooklyn Nets breaks, because we do want to hear that something's happening for Brooklyn because they need to add talent. Do all those great things. We appreciate all the support. And as we always know, with no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend and I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. Basketball. All right, sticking around for a few more minutes. The post podcast is on. Let's take a look in here. As we know, if you want to shout out any questions you have at Locked On, and yeah, this is like a good, like, I didn't bother noting this just with the amount of content. It's like good to point out here the new CBA. I'm not sure if tax repeaters can even sign and trade anymore, and we fall into the repeater. This is a part of the evaluation of what the Brooklyn Nets need to do when it comes to where they sit in the cap, and then whether or not they could make those correlating moves. So as we said, They currently sit at 145 million. There's the cap hold, I think, at around 17 for a player like Cameron Johnson. So then that pushes you up over the 162-ish kind of range. But if you get yourself under that with a Joe Harris move, with a Patty Mills move, right? If you bring that down, then you can reset yourself and the opportunities. We'll dive into that a little bit more here as we work our way through. But I wanted to make sure, and it's good for you. What is that? Hustle. Just pointing it out. I didn't get a chance to get into it, but there are all these new CBA cliff notes, some updates around that. There are going to be restrictions. So sometimes when we just look at what is possible, it really is about setting the table and then allowing to, setting the table and then evaluating what is possible as we move forward. Some good things like this, saying, again, Trey, good with Ben, right? So there's also some thought processes around trying to think about, if we dream a little dream on Ben Simmons, can we get a player that fits with him? That when you have an oversized, guard, forward, everything, all in one, defensive stopper, right? A guy that can pick up the most difficult assignments, a guy that can switch, a guy that can play against bigs, a guy that can work the ball in transition, in theory, right? Then having a smaller guard on the floor with him is going to make it a lot easier. I like this. Imagine Kuzma and Smith playing the same team again. Yeah, it's not going to happen, but it would be fun to think about. Taking in, I'm just noting this here, right? Kelly is solid. The 53 shooting percentage is not good. Yeah, like, these, when you're putting out these stats, it's not all saying, hey, this is all good. This is what we like, and this is the areas of concern that we're going to have. Here you go. So this was the other one too. Go into Dosunmu, likely price, combo guard. Yeah, so let's take a look at, I'll remind you guys, I don't know if I put that number out when I was looking at it. Let's go back to Dosunmu. They had him listed. The board's evaluation on him was 5.8 million, right? So the way that John Hollinger laid this out, given his youth and likely inexpensive cost, a return to the Bulls should be in order. Chicago can make him a restricted free agent by submitting a 5.2 million qualifying offer and should be able to bring him back and accomplish other offseason priorities without pushing past the tax apron, right? So that's what we're talking about just in terms of the likelihood. So sometimes too, I'm trying to also look at the way that these players are getting talked about and the likelihood that they're going to return, right? Vucevic to look right at Chicago. It was like, yeah, he's on the market and here's his value. And I'm not saying I had an interest for him in the Nets or anyone else did, but every indication was like, he is going to be back with Chicago. There's no reason to even consider the idea of it. He wanted to be back there. Chicago wanted him back. And that's why that extension was already getting indicated well before free agency kicked off. In a player like Dosunmu, let's see. So he came in right in the door playing 77 games and starting 40 his rookie year, 80 and 51 this past season. Field goal percentage, just a hair under 50 this past year. 3-point shooting took a big drop. Same volume, but only knocked down 31% this past season. So you wonder a little bit about that. Where's his true? I don't see his true shooting percentage up here. Free throw percentage, though he doesn't get to the line at all, which is somewhat shocking. 80%. And he's a guy that's giving you about 3 assists per game across that line. Again, he's an upside guy, right? He's a guy that you're jumping in on now because you believe he's about to take the leap. The problem for the Brooklyn Nets is having enough to say, the MLE, 6.7 million. Is that going to be enough that Chicago wouldn't look at that and say, okay, we offer the 5.2 qualifying restricted free agent. You know what I mean? And Dosunmu could probably look at it too and say the qualifying offer and holding myself in place for a minute here and waiting to see a year from now with Caruso, a year from now with other veterans on this team, he may only be a season or two away from getting a real extension, making some real money. So, and by the way, not that the Brooklyn Nets can't offer that same path forward, right? You're only 1 year away from Spencer Dinwiddie potentially being off of this roster. You feel like Joe Harris, and that we're moving around a little bit. Patty Mills isn't going to be there. They didn't bring back or extend any offers to David Duke Jr. or Drew Smith, right? Like they've cleared out that backcourt there. So you certainly can look at it and feel like you have a path forward. Let's see. Let me hit a couple here. Been seeing you up here, Jean Rame. I think a Jean Rame, a little French inflection there. Do you think it's a great idea if Nets re-sign Yuta and trade Harris for a pick for next year because we don't have one? Yeah, the Yuta one is interesting to me because all indications are it's going to be like a minimum deal, and they've already talked about how Phoenix would make a lot of sense because he obviously played in support of Kevin Durant, so they know what that fit would look like there. Would the Nets like to bring him back? Yes. But do I know if they're willing to go beyond that? Or do they look at it and say, in bringing back Yuta at his age, what does it mean? I would bring back Yuta. Like, I think that he works and he fits in here and he has just enough defensive value and just enough to his offensive game, that especially at the cost. Yes, I think it makes sense. The trading Joe Harris for a pick next year, I have no way to know until we would hear it that Joe Harris has value for anything, a second round pick, even in next year's draft at $20 million, right? It's supposed to be supposedly a bad draft class next year. So could a back end first round team think it's interesting? Maybe, but we've been under the assumption that it would take attaching something to that contract. Now, again, a team may look at it differently now under the new CBA and taking in that money and knowing what it could mean for them going forward. So would I bring back Yuta? Yes, I would. I have no idea what's going to happen with Joe outside of if you could, you'd like to move off the money just to bring that cap number down, regardless of what else happens. Here's another good one. Would trading Ben for Cat be that bad? I understand the financial, but at least Cat can be turned around. What do you think? I mean, talking about turning around. I mean, he's a good player and he's a great player. But that $256 million impending contract, I just don't think that if you're the Brooklyn Nets, and I know we don't want to live in these waters, but we talked about trading for the next high profile guy or, trading for a Dame Lillard, looking at the market right now. We don't know how the next couple of years are going to unfold here. Right. So I think keeping the powder dry on making that big move would make sense for Brooklyn right now. And, you're only, the timeline of getting off the Ben Simmons money is significant. If you bring back Cameron Johnson at whatever that number is, you at least know that you're only moments away, if Ben Simmons doesn't round back into form, of being able to get $40 million off the books, another 20 with Joe Harris. That Claxton's contract is going to be coming up, right? So I think you just hesitate with how big that contract is going to balloon. Johnny, good to see you, sir. Coby White and Drummond be enticing for the Brooklyn to consider 3-point scoring and rebounding. Get addressed here. Yeah, I don't have an interest in Andre Drummond. He went back to Chicago, obviously. Now, maybe you're saying, going and getting him here. I like Coby White. I mean, I said it here inside of this. I'm a big fan of Coby White. I would, if, we're putting to the hierarchy, I talked about Christian Wood right up at the TPE line. I would look at a Coby White. If you could get him underneath the TPE, I would be very interested in a player like that. Again, he falls in the same thing as Dosunmu, young player in a veteran-heavy team right now in Chicago that a season from now could look drastically different. The question becomes, how is Chicago looking at him, and how are they going to try to manage it, right? If an offer from the Brooklyn Nets or otherwise came in, would Chicago be inclined to automatically match? They do have the flexibility under the cap. I like him. Leave off the Drummond part of this and bring me Coby White. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Coby White. And if you could go land him, it would certainly be an option I would like. Let's hit up Iceman. What is your take on Taurean Prince if we end up trading DFS or Royce O'Neal? Yeah, that's, I know, obviously familiar. Friend of the show, I hesitate on him, I think. And I think he's in here somewhere. By the way, Yuta Watanabe gets mentioned at the 3 as being the 20th available here. And just to round out that conversation very quickly, had a breakout year in Brooklyn, shot 44% from 3, but the Nets are crowded at the forward position, makes it seem unlikely he's back. Solid defender with a limited offensive repertoire beyond the catch and shoot game. He's a good pickup as a 4th forward. This is Hollinger's evaluation. And then they talk about potentially going out there to Phoenix. I'll try to get here into let's see, because he was on here, Taurean Prince. Hernan Gomez was also on this list that I thought for the minimum, I wouldn't hate it. And I also, did I write down? I don't know if I wrote down. Let me take a look here since we got the time. If you guys aren't busy. I didn't mind Jack White two-way restricted Denver, right? Because he shot 44% from three after being a non-factor in college. So he pivoted his game in a big way. Jack White was an interesting one. Again, these back-end guys that are on two-way deals, restricted for other teams. Hey, watch out. You're getting an opportunity to potentially be a rotation, a back end of the bench guy that gets in the garbage time minutes and tries to develop. 25 years old. So on the older side of things, it's a little bit hard to look at him too favorably, but it at least has to be mentioned. I can't see where Taurean Prince fell here. I'm not terribly interested in it, although I do like him as a glue guy, as a locker room guy. It'd probably be a vet minimum, so I would have no problem with that. What do we got here? This is unrelated, but after James Harden fiasco trade is over, what's the likelihood Joel Embiid? Yeah, this is and I'm not sorry, I got to address this one real quick. I know you like Thomas Bryant. Did I talk about him today? I talked about him, I think, on the Center podcast, yesterday's episode. I mentioned very briefly the reason why I don't like Thomas Bryant is because he got benched in the playoffs. He could not find playoff minutes. Now, deeper teams, it looks a little bit different. I get that. I'm not against Thomas Bryant, by the way. Like, I like him as a player. And the price point is not much at all. So if you want to bring him in, that's great. But I only put this up here because I wouldn't say it's a must. I think that it's an option. I'd be fine with it. I'd be interested in it. I would like to see how he plays and what the balance that he could bring to the center position for the Brooklyn Nets with Nicholas Claxton. But I can't put must. I can't double underline his name. Okay. This is just, so I'll take it at a high level, John. This is why you don't want to overcommit to something. James Harden is opting in so they can work on a trade. Tobias Harris is there with his money. Like, there's a lot of moving parts going on in Philadelphia right now. And while you would never think for a second that they're going to move away from Joel Embiid as our nucleus and then we work our way out from there, you have to understand and respect the fact that push could come to shove here, where Joel looks around and says, I've been through a lot of iterations of this team, and it never quite seems to get there. He's had his own injury history. We know that, but he's still one of the best players in the league, right? So I just think that the Brooklyn Nets being patient and seeing how certain things play out across the NBA would make a lot of sense for them. And anybody of Joel Embiid's level, right, requesting a trade at some point, the Brooklyn Nets could now sit here and say, yeah, we have all the draft capital to go do something like that. I know. And I know what you're saying. It's like, this is why you do it, right? This is why you're patient for it to see. And by the way, like, even though I would never, and we talked about this of like just watching stars and how things kind of unfold here. If Kyrie doesn't go back to Dallas, they have to again then reboot and retool themselves. They did a great job in the draft. I loved how they went about it. They obviously got Max Prosper, which was a really big fan of. But when you look at that team and that roster, again, you have a star who's like, hey man, I want to win. Now he seems, Luka, of the demeanor of like, I'm here, I'm committed. But we've seen it with Dame Lillard in Portland, right? It at least starts to wear on you at a certain point if you don't continually find yourself in conference finals with chances to go to the NBA finals, right? So that's why you keep an eye on stars, and I think you try to keep yourself a little bit fluid here just in case. If nothing else, guys, if nothing else is on the table, we'll get out the door. I got to get this one for the podcast feed. It's why you come in over here on YouTube, because you get this before the podcast feed gets uploaded. Congratulations. We ran down the list. I'll go ahead. If you're following us over on social, at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie, at Locked On Nets, I'm going to reiterate where I was on a lot of these guys. So if you go over, I had said coming in that we had about 20 guys. I had 20 names from the highest level of TPE down to the back end minimum two-way contract players that I thought the Brooklyn Nets should take a look at. I'll refine it down and I'll try to get to, let's call it like 10 players that I think the Nets could look at and have some real opportunity to have some success with, and at least take the short-term narrative and say the team has gotten a little bit stronger, a little bit deeper, and maybe create some flexibility. When you look at a Dorian Finney-Smith and you look at a Royce O'Neal, whatever Sean Marks has set as the price point for them, you can get a little bit more flexibility if you go and make some moves on the market and feel like you can go ahead and take a look elsewhere and maybe accept, to the point that was brought up earlier, hey, could we get a first round pick in a weak draft class next year for Dorian Finney-Smith? Okay, we just need to know that we have an option here in-house that could step in and be a starter, be the rotation player, and continue to work. Okay, one last one here, because it looks like there's a compliment in here. Yeah, there you go. Going back, and this goes back to Brooklyn trade for both Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith for significant draft capital to make a big move. Yeah, so again, you can continue to move in that direction. You're always going to have those options. Remember, there's the guaranteed money coming in for Royce O'Neal, ballooning it up to a little bit north of $9 million. Still a team-friendly deal for Dorian Finney-Smith. I think it behooves the Nets, especially with his contract and the longevity of it, to still try to find a way to capitalize on that. Like him at 31 and then at 32, it's going to be a great team contract. So you can just play it out with him on this roster. And maybe that is the pivot to Royce being the tradable guy. But we got to see how free agency starts to play out here. Maybe the Nets get involved and one of these players gets involved going forward. I will just note, in the short term, and then always end up being wrong on something here, but in the short term, it just feels like the Nets are trying to make some marginal gains here and maybe not rock the boat immediately, unless you can elevate from one tier of player you want to target to another by moving someone like Dorian Finney-Smith and getting extra draft capital to utilize in a deal. Thank you, everybody. Absolutely appreciate everyone in here. There's been a lot of fun. Give some feedback over on YouTube as well. While Doug and I don't normally do like the live ones or early in the morning sessions, maybe we'll try to work a couple of these in, especially in the off season here, right? When we don't have any post games, etc. I'll talk about bringing home. I'll talk about bringing home Kenyon Martin's son, right? In a trade. There's certainly options. And by the way, one last note here, looking at teams that have a ton of money to spend in free agency, seeing how they spend their money and then watching for what the fallout could be on their roster actually is critical. Teams like Detroit, teams like Houston, right? Teams like the Spurs that have money, like these teams, when they start making their decisions, there is going to be a trickle-down effect to how their rosters get constructed. And the Nets maybe could, again, nip at the heels of finding some value when teams need to either move off a contract or outright just part ways, like we saw with Akira Lewis Jr. and other players around the league. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We will catch up with you later today. Keep your alerts on for Locked On Nets. We'll be doing this thing all day long, and we'll see you next time right here on the Locked On Nets podcast, where we're talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.